Her tiny hands were trembling as she clutched at the stranger's velvet coat. Tears streaked down her face. Her voice cracked with desperation. "Please, sir, the bad ones are hurting my mama. She's dying." The great hall fell deathly silent. Wine glasses froze mid-air. Ancient conversations died on immortal lips. Every supernatural eye turned toward the child. But the creature she had chosen to beg was no ordinary vampire. He was Draven Valdrich, the vampire king, ruler of the night for over 300 years, and what he did next would shake the foundations of the immortal world forever. Stay with me until the end, because this story will leave you breathless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. It's a moonless Thursday evening in the French Quarter of New Orleans, 2024. The Crescent Hall, hidden behind the facade of an upscale wine bar on Charter Street, hummed with the distinct energy of immortal beings conducting ancient business. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen, where creatures of legend discussed territory, blood rights, and the delicate balance that kept their world hidden from human eyes. This wasn't just any gathering. This was the Midnight Council. Every server moving between tables was a bound familiar who knew to see nothing, hear nothing, speak nothing. Every being seated understood the ancient protocols. You respected the hierarchy, you honored the blood oaths, and you never ever disrupted the council. Draven Valdrich sat at his usual position at the head table, a figure carved from pale marble and darkness itself. At over 3 centuries old, he had built an empire that stretched from the bayou of Louisiana to the shadows of 7 states. His platinum hair gleamed under candlelight. His eyes, cold as winter frost, missed nothing. His word was absolute law in the supernatural world. And tonight, like every first Thursday for the past 200 years, he was presiding over the monthly territorial negotiations with the regional vampire covens, werewolf packs, and witch circles. Draven Valdrich didn't breathe. He hadn't needed to in 297 years, but he maintained the habit anyway, a remnant of the man he'd been in 1727, before the darkness claimed him, before immortality became both his crown and his curse. Tonight, he observed the Midnight Council with the same cold calculation that had kept him on the throne, longer than most vampires survived their first century. The Crescent Hall buzzed with a particular energy of creatures who'd learned to wear human faces while harboring inhuman appetites. Werewolf alphas in Italian suits, witch matriarchs dripping with diamonds that hummed with enchantment, vampire lords whose smiles never quite reached their ancient eyes. They all answered to him, not through affection. Draven had abandoned that weakness the night his mortal daughter died in his arms, her small body consumed by a plague while he could only watch, helpless and human. No, they answered to him through something far more reliable than love. Fear, respect, the bone-deep understanding that Draven Valdrich had survived 3 centuries not through mercy, but through absolute unwavering dominance. His reputation preceded him into every room. The vampire king who'd ended the blood wars of 1823 by executing 7 rebel lords in a single night. The immortal who'd written the Covenant of Shadows, the treaty that kept supernatural beings hidden from human discovery, the creature who could drain a vampire of their essence with nothing but ancient magic and force of will, leaving them as empty husks before the sun even rose. Tonight's council was routine, territorial disputes between the North Shore Pack and the Bayou Coven, trade agreements for spelled artifacts between the witch circles and vampire bloodlines, the delicate dance of power that kept New Orleans' supernatural community from tearing itself apart. Silas Bloodthorn was notably absent. Draven's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The rogue vampire had been pushing boundaries for months, testing the limits of Draven's patience. Rumors whispered through the shadows. Silas was building something, gathering followers, seeking power that belonged to no single vampire. The Bloodthorn sect operated just outside the established territories, just beyond the reach of council law, a problem Draven would soon correct. Marcus Dero, Draven's second-in-command, leaned close. His voice dropped to a murmur meant only for supernatural ears. The North Shore Alpha is getting aggressive. He wants the waterfront territories. He wants many things, Draven replied, his tone glacial. What he wants and what he'll receive are vastly different matters. The chandeliers cast warm light across the assembled immortals, but Draven existed in his own pocket of cold. He perfected the art of being present while remaining utterly untouchable. His platinum hair gleamed like frost. His black velvet suit absorbed light as readily as he absorbed fear. 300 years had taught him that true power wasn't found in dramatic displays of violence, but in the quiet certainty that violence was always an option. The werewolf Alpha stood, his challenge written in the set of his shoulders. The Valdrich bloodline has held the waterfront for 2 centuries. Times change. Territories should change with them. Draven's gaze fixed on him, pale blue eyes that had witnessed empires rise and crumble. I was ancient when your great-grandfather first learned to shift. Sit down. The Alpha sat. This was the natural order. This was how the immortal world maintained its fragile peace. Through hierarchy, through fear, through the absolute rule of creatures who'd learned that compassion was a luxury the undead couldn't afford. Draven lifted his wineglass, not wine, of course, but something darker, richer, that sustained his immortal existence. He was mid-sip when the impossible happened. The enchanted doors, sealed with magic that should repel any uninvited mortal, burst open. A child stumbled through the shattered doorway. The entire hall went rigid. Conversations died mid-word. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Every supernatural creature in the Crescent Hall turned toward the impossible sight. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her pink dress was torn at the hem. Dust and dirt smudged across the fabric. Her light brown hair hung in tangled curls around her face, and her cheeks were streaked with something dark. Tears mixed with what looked like dried crimson marks running from the corners of her mouth, but it was her eyes that struck Draven like a stake through the chest. Wide, terrified, desperate, yet somehow seeing. Truly seeing in a way no mortal child should be able to. The enchantments on those doors were 3 centuries old. Draven himself had woven them with blood, magic, and ancient words. No uninvited human could cross that threshold. The spell should have turned her around, confused her, sent her running in the opposite direction without ever knowing why. Yet here she stood, small and trembling and utterly out of place among immortal predators. Marcus moved first, vampire speed, carrying him halfway to the child before Draven's hand shot out, stopping him with a single gesture. "Don't!" Draven commanded, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. The little girl's gaze swept across the room, past werewolf alphas and witch matriarchs, past vampire lords whose very presence should have sent her fleeing in primal terror. Her eyes skipped over all of them as if searching for something, someone specific. Then her gaze locked onto Draven. She ran, not away, as any sensible mortal would, toward him. Her small shoes slapped against marble floors as she rushed past tables full of creatures that could tear her apart without thinking. No one moved. No one breathed. The audacity of it had frozen the most powerful beings in 7 states. She reached Draven's table and grabbed his velvet coat with both tiny hands, her fingers clutching the fabric like a lifeline. Tears spilled down her cheeks, fresh tracks cutting through the grime on her face. "Please," she sobbed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, sir. The bad ones are hurting my mama. They're hitting her, and she told me to run, but I don't know what to do, and she's going to die." The child's words tumbled out in a frantic rush, each one hitting harder than the last. Draven stared down at her. 300 years of calculated coldness, 3 centuries of ruthless control, every lesson he'd learned about burying his humanity, about ruling through fear rather than feeling, and all of it crumbled as he looked into those desperate, pleading eyes. Because for just one heartbreaking moment he wasn't seeing this child. He was seeing Eleanor, his daughter, his little girl, lost to plague and time, who'd looked at him with those same desperate eyes as the fever consumed her, and he'd been powerless, human, unable to save her. "Please," Audrey whispered again, her voice barely audible, "please help my mama." The Midnight Council held its collective breath, waiting to see what the Vampire King would do. The world narrowed to a single point. The child's face, those eyes, that desperate, terrified hope that somehow, against all logic, he could save her. Draven's mind fractured, and suddenly he wasn't in New Orleans anymore. He was in Marseille, 1723, the plague year that had swallowed France. The memory crashed over him with brutal clarity. His modest home near the harbour. The smell of herbs his wife Catherine had burned to ward off sickness. The sound of Eleanor's laboured breathing from the small bedroom. She'd been 6 years old, small for her age, with light brown curls that bounced when she laughed. She wasn't laughing that winter. Draven had been mortal then. Jean-Baptiste Valdric, a merchant who traded in wines and silk, who'd built a comfortable life through hard work and careful planning. A man who believed that if you were smart enough, careful enough, you could protect the people you loved. The plague had proven him wrong. He had held Eleanor as the fever consumed her, her small body burning in his arms, while Catherine sobbed prayers that went unanswered. He had watched his daughter's eyes, those same desperate, pleading eyes, searching his face for salvation he couldn't provide. "Papa," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. "Papa hurts." "I know, my love, I know." He pressed his lips to her burning forehead, his own tears falling into her hair. "Just hold on, please, Eleanor, just hold on." But she hadn't held on. She'd slipped away just before dawn. Her final breath, a quiet surrender that shattered everything Jean-Baptiste Valdric thought he understood about the world. Catherine had followed 3 days later, her body too weak to fight, her heart too broken to try. He buried them both in the cemetery on the hill, and then he'd done something unforgivable. The vampire had found him there, kneeling in the dirt between fresh graves. Alejandro had been ancient even then, a creature who'd walked the earth for 1,000 years. He'd offered Jean-Baptiste a choice: die with his grief, or live forever and never feel that helpless again. Draven had chosen immortality, not out of courage, but out of cowardice. He couldn't face another sunrise knowing his family was gone, couldn't bear the weight of his own mortality, his own weakness, his absolute failure to protect the 2 people who'd mattered most. The transformation had been agony. 3 days of fire in his veins, his heart stopping and starting, and finally going still. When he'd risen on the 4th night, Jean-Baptiste Valdric was gone. Draven Valdric had taken his place. A creature without weakness, without vulnerability, without the capacity for the kind of love that could destroy you. He'd spent 3 centuries proving it, building an empire, ruling through fear, burying every trace of the father and husband he'd been beneath layers of calculated cruelty. Until now. Until a 7-year-old girl with light brown curls and desperate eyes grabbed his coat and begged him for help. Audrey's face blurred with Eleanor's past and present colliding. The child he'd failed and the child who somehow impossibly believed he could save her mother. Draven's hand moved before his mind could stop it. His pale fingers, which had ended countless lives without hesitation, reached out and gently touched the top of Audrey's head. "Where is your mother?" His voice came out rougher than intended. Centuries of rust on emotions he'd thought were dead. St. Mercy Cathedral rose against the night sky like a broken tooth. The old stone structure had been abandoned for decades, its stained glass windows shattered, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges, Spanish moss draped from crumbling archways like funeral shrouds. It was exactly the kind of place rogue vampires would choose. Draven moved through the darkness, with his elite guard flanking him, Marcus on his left, Celeste on his right, and 6 others fanning out in perfect formation. They didn't run. They flowed shadow to shadow, their movements too quick for mortal eyes to track. Audrey clung to Marcus's back, her small arms wrapped around his neck. Draven had wanted to leave her at the Crescent Hall, but she'd refused to let go of his coat, her tears starting fresh. "I have to show you where Mama is," she'd insisted, with a stubbornness that reminded him painfully of Eleanor. So she came, protected, surrounded by the deadliest creatures in Louisiana. The cathedral's main entrance hung open, an invitation that reeked of arrogance. Draven raised his hand, stopping his guard 20 feet from the threshold. His senses stretched outward, reading the space the way a mortal might read a book. 3 vampires inside, 2 positioned near the altar, 1 moving in the shadows of what had once been the nave and something else, a human heartbeat, weak and irregular, struggling to maintain its rhythm. "Beverly Marcus, take the child to the rectory. Keep her there." Draven's voice was ice and command. "Celeste, north entrance. Raphael, south. No one leaves." They moved without question, disappearing into the darkness. Draven walked through the cathedral doors alone. The interior was a graveyard of faith. Pews lay overturned and rotting. The altar had been defaced. Religious symbols scratched away or painted over. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. 2 vampires stepped into view. Young ones, maybe 50 years turned. Stupid enough to think age didn't matter. 1 male, 1 female, both wearing the cocky expressions of creatures who'd never faced real power. "You're trespassing, Valdrich," the male said, his voice carrying an Italian accent. "The Bloodthorn sect doesn't answer to your counsel." Draven didn't bother responding. He simply gestured. The male vampire's bravado shattered as invisible force lifted him off his feet and slammed him against a stone pillar. The female lunged, vampire speed carrying her across the space in a blur. Draven caught her by the throat without looking, his grip stopping her momentum completely. "Where's the woman?" The female clawed at his hand, her supernatural strength meaningless against his ancient power. "The crypt," she choked out. "Below." He dropped her. "Go. Tell Silas Bloodthorn the Vampire King is coming for him. Tell him what happened here." They fled, their pride forgotten, their arrogance replaced by the primal understanding that they'd just encountered a predator so far above them on the food chain that resistance was suicide. Draven found the entrance to the crypt behind the ruined altar. Stone steps descended into darkness. He could smell blood now, fresh human, pooling on cold stone. The crypt was small, barely 10 feet across. Beverly lay on the floor, her wrists bound with rope, her face bruised and swelling. A vampire stood over her, his boot pressed against her shoulder. He looked up as Draven appeared, and whatever he saw in the Vampire King's eyes made him stumble backward. "She won't talk," the vampire stammered. "We've been questioning her about the codex, but she says she doesn't know. Leave." The single word carried 3 centuries of lethal intent. The vampire vanished up the stairs. Draven knelt beside Beverly, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain. "Audrey," she whispered, "where's she safe? Your daughter is safe." Draven bit into his own wrist, ancient blood welling dark and rich. "This will hurt, but it will heal you. Do you understand?" Beverly's eyes widened as she saw his fangs, understanding and terror warring across her bruised face. But then Audrey's voice echoed from somewhere above. "Mama," and maternal instinct overrode fear. She nodded. Draven pressed his wrist to her lips. His blood, 3 centuries old and heavy with power, flowed into her mortal system. It would heal her wounds, close the cuts, ease the pain. It wouldn't turn her. That required far more, but it would pull her back from the edge. Beverly gasped, her body arching as ancient magic worked through mortal veins. Above them, Audrey's footsteps pattered closer despite Marcus's protests. Dreven had saved the mother. Now he'd have to face the daughter and explain what he'd just become. Her family's protector, bound by a debt 300 years in the making. The two rogue vampires had a 3-minute head start. In the world of immortals, that meant nothing. Celeste tracked them from the cathedral, her senses locked onto their distinct signatures, the way a bloodhound follows scent. The male, his name was Marcos, she'd learned from whispers in the underground, was heading east toward the French Quarter. The female, Lucinda, had split off toward the river. Raphael, take Lucinda. Celeste spoke into the night, knowing her words would carry to the other enforcer on supernatural frequencies. Marcos is mine. She launched herself onto the cathedral's roof, her body moving with the fluid grace of a predator who'd perfected the hunt over 2 centuries. The city spread below her, a grid of lights and shadows, music and life pulsing through the quarter's veins. Marcos was fast. She'd give him that. He vaulted across rooftops, leaping gaps that would kill a mortal, using the architectural chaos of the French Quarter to his advantage. Raw iron balconies became handholds. Narrow alleyways became shortcuts. He was running for his life, and fear made even young vampires dangerous. But Celeste was patient. She had hunted creatures far older and far more cunning than this Italian fool who thought serving Silas Bloodthorn was a path to power. She tracked him, across Bourbon Street's neon glow, over the silent darkness of residential blocks, through the Garden District, where old money slept behind high walls, and older magic. Marcos glanced back once, his face twisted with panic when he saw her still following, still closing the distance with methodical precision. He made his mistake at the old Montelot Hotel. Instead of continuing across the rooftops, he dropped to street level, probably hoping to lose himself in the late-night crowd of tourists stumbling between bars. Celeste smiled. Amateur. She descended like a falling shadow, landing in the alley ahead of him, cutting off his escape. Marcos skidded to a stop, his back against the brick wall, his eyes darting for another exit. "There isn't one," Celeste said calmly. "You're coming back to face the Vampire King. You can walk or I can drag you. Choose quickly." Marcos lunged at her, fangs bared, desperation overriding sense. She sidestepped his attack with minimal effort, grabbed his arm, and twisted. The sound of supernatural bone cracking echoed off the alley walls. Marcos screamed, then choked as Celeste's hand found his throat. "Walking it is," she said, though they both knew he no longer had a choice. Across the city near the river docks, Raphael had cornered Lucinda in an abandoned warehouse. The female vampire had tried to hide among the rusted machinery and forgotten cargo, as if centuries-old senses couldn't pinpoint a heartbeat, even an undead one in the darkness. "Silas won't protect you," Raphael called out, his voice echoing through the vast space. "He sent you on a fool's mission against a human woman, and now you've drawn the king's attention. You're already dead. The only question is whether you'll cooperate and die with some dignity." Lucinda emerged from behind a shipping container, her hands raised in surrender. She'd seen what happened to vampires who resisted Draven Valdrich. She'd heard the stories. Better to face interrogation than face complete annihilation. "I'll tell you whatever you want to know," she said, her voice shaking. "Just please, I didn't know she was under the king's protection. Silas said she was nobody. He said it was a simple retrieval." "Then you've been lied to," Raphael replied. "And now you'll tell us everything about what Silas is really planning." 20 minutes later, both prisoners were secured in Draven's underground holding chambers beneath his mansion in the Garden District. The room was old stone and older magic, enchantments woven into the walls that suppressed supernatural abilities and made escape impossible. Marcos nursed his broken arm in one corner, his earlier bravado completely shattered. Lucinda sat with her knees drawn up, looking far younger than her 50 years of immortality. Draven descended the stone steps, his footsteps echoing with finality. Behind him, Marcus carried Beverly, still weak, but healing rapidly from the ancient blood in her system. Audrey clutched Marcus's coat, her eyes wide as she took in the supernatural prison. The vampire king stopped before his prisoners, his pale eyes reflecting centuries of judgment. "Now," he said quietly, "tell me everything about the Crimson Codex, and tell me why Silas Bloodthorn thinks it's worth declaring war over." Marcos talked first. Fear had a way of loosening tongues, even immortal ones. "The Crimson Codex is ancient," he said, his voice trembling as Draven's presence filled the chamber like a physical weight. "Older than the Council, older than the Covenant. Silas says it was written by the first vampire ever turned, that it contains rituals and blood magic lost for millennia." Draven's expression remained unchanged, but Marcus, standing guard near the door, felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Continue," Draven commanded. Lucinda picked up where Marcos faltered. "Silas has been searching for it for decades. He tracked it to a vampire huntress named Catherine Russo, who died 15 years ago. She'd stolen it from a coven in Prague, kept it hidden her entire life." She glanced at Beverly, who sat on a stone bench with Audrey curled against her side. "We didn't know Catherine had a daughter. We didn't know the Codex had been passed down as an inheritance." Beverly's face had gone pale. "My mother's things," she whispered. "After she died, I inherited some jewelry, some old books I couldn't read. I thought they were just family heirlooms." "The Codex can take many forms," Marcos added quickly, eager to be helpful. "It's protected by ancient magic. To anyone who doesn't know what they're looking for, it appears as something ordinary, a book of prayers, a piece of jewelry, something you'd keep but never think twice about." Draven's gaze shifted to Beverly. "Where are your mother's belongings now?" "Most of them are in storage. Some I kept, I wear." Beverly's hand went to her throat, touching a delicate silver necklace that had been hidden beneath her collar. "I wear her necklace. She said it was important that I should keep it close." The necklace was simple. A silver chain with a small pendant, circular, engraved with symbols that could have been decorative flourishes or something far older. Beverly unclasped it with shaking hands and held it out. Draven took it carefully, his ancient eyes studying the pendant in the dim light. The symbols were definitely not decorative. They were Old Tongue, the vampire language that predated written history. He could feel the magic humming through the silver, dormant but powerful, waiting for someone who knew how to wake it. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is what Silas has been hunting." Audrey had been quiet through the entire interrogation, her small face pressed against her mother's shoulder. But now she stirred, pulling away and reaching into the pocket of her pink dress. "I draw, Mama," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Before the bad people came. Do you want to see?" She held out a piece of paper crumpled and smudged with dirt. It was a child's crayon drawing, simple, earnest, the kind of art that decorated refrigerators in normal homes. A stick figure woman with brown hair and a big smile, and around her neck, rendered in careful silver crayon, a circular necklace with symbols that a 7-year-old had tried to copy. "Mama always wears Grandma's special necklace," Audrey explained, pointing at her drawing. "She says it keeps us safe." The irony wasn't lost on Draven. The child had drawn a map to the very thing that had put her mother in danger, not knowing what those symbols meant, not understanding that her innocent art had captured something ancient and deadly. Marcos and Lucinda stared at the drawing, then at the necklace in Draven's hand, then at each other with growing horror. They had tortured Beverly for hours, demanding she reveal the Codex's location, never realizing it had been around her neck the entire time. "Silas will come for it," Lucinda said softly. He'll bring the entire Bloodthorn sect. He's obsessed. He believes the codex will give him power to challenge the council to build an army that can't be stopped. The codex contains the ritual of mass turning, Marcos added, his voice barely above a whisper. One vampire could turn hundreds in a single night, thousands in a week. The binding magic that limits our numbers, that keeps us from overrunning the mortal world. The codex can break it. Draven's fingers closed around the pendant. 3 centuries of maintaining balance, 300 years of enforcing the laws that kept vampires from becoming the plague they could be. And Silas Bloodthorn wanted to shatter everything for the sake of power. "Where is Silas now?" Draven asked. "The iron works," Lucinda answered immediately. "The abandoned industrial complex at the river's edge. That's where he's gathering his followers." Draven turned to Marcus. "Take Beverly and Audrey upstairs. Put them in the east wing under guard. No one enters those rooms without my explicit permission." He looked at the mother and daughter, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You're safe here. I give you my word." Audrey looked up at him with those same desperate, trusting eyes. "Are you going to stop the bad man?" Draven knelt down, so they were eye level. For just a moment, 3 centuries of calculated coldness melted away, and the father he'd buried in 1723 looked out through ancient eyes. "Yes," he promised, "I'm going to stop him." The message reached Silas Bloodthorn before dawn. A single black envelope sealed with Draven's personal sigil, a crown wrapped in thorns, rendered in blood-red wax. Inside, written in precise script that hadn't changed in 3 centuries, was an invitation that read more like a summons. "Neutral ground, the iron works, midnight tomorrow. Come alone, or don't come at all." Silas stared at the message in his lair beneath the abandoned industrial complex, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. His enforcers had returned with tales of the Vampire King's intervention, of Marcos and Lucinda's capture, of the human woman now under Valdric's protection, but Silas Bloodthorn hadn't survived 200 years by being reckless. He knew what this meeting meant. Draven was offering him a chance to negotiate before declaring open war, the Vampire King's version of mercy, a velvet glove concealing an iron fist. Silas would go, but he wouldn't go defenseless. The iron works at midnight looked like something from a nightmare. Rusted metal skeletons of old machinery rose against the sky like the bones of dead giants. The Mississippi River flowed black and silent beyond the crumbling dock. Moonlight barely penetrated the heavy clouds, casting everything in shades of grey and shadow. Draven arrived first, standing in the center of the main foundry floor where molten metal had once flowed and mortal men had labored. Now it was empty, echoing perfect neutral ground where no vampire held territorial advantage. Marcus and Celeste waited in the shadows outside, under strict orders not to intervene unless Silas broke the terms. This was between kings, between 2 creatures who'd walked the earth long enough to understand that some conflicts required direct confrontation. Silas appeared precisely at midnight, stepping through the gaping entrance where loading bay doors had once hung. He was younger than Draven by a century, but old enough to be dangerous. Dark-haired where Draven was platinum, broad-shouldered where Draven was lean. He wore modern clothes, black jeans, leather jacket, while Draven remained in his formal velvet suit. They were studies in contrast, old world and new, tradition and rebellion. Valdric. Silas's voice carried across the empty space, thick with Italian accent and barely restrained hostility. "You killed my operations, captured my people, protected a human who possesses something that doesn't belong to her." "The Crimson Codex belongs to no one," Draven replied, his tone glacial. "And it certainly doesn't belong to an upstart who thinks 2 centuries gives him the right to challenge laws older than nations." Silas laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. Laws you wrote, a council you control. You've held power so long, you've forgotten what it's like to hunger for it. I've held power so long because I understand what you don't. Draven took a single step forward. Power without restraint isn't strength, it's suicide. The codex contains rituals that would expose our entire world to human discovery. You trade centuries of careful balance for what? An army you can't control, a plague you can't stop. I trade your stagnant peace for evolution, Silas countered, moving closer as well. Vampires hiding in shadows, limiting our numbers, bowing to your ancient treaties. We could rule this world, Valdric. We should rule it. The space between them had shrunk to 20 feet. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of supernatural tension that made reality itself seem fragile. You're right about one thing, Draven said quietly. I have held power for a very long time. Long enough to have seen a dozen vampires just like you rise with grand visions of conquest. Do you know where they are now? Silas's jaw tightened. Dust, Draven finished. Every single one of them. Because power isn't about how much you can take. It's about knowing exactly when to stop. Silas lunged first, his patience finally breaking. Vampire speed carried him across the space in a blur, his hand reaching for Draven's throat with the kind of raw aggression that came from 2 centuries of fighting his way up from nothing. Draven didn't move. Silas's hand stopped 3 inches from its target, frozen mid-air, as if he'd hit an invisible wall. His eyes widened in shock as he realized he couldn't push forward, couldn't retreat, couldn't move at all. Did you really think, Draven said quietly, that I would meet you here without preparation? The symbols became visible then, ancient markings etched into the foundry floor in a pattern so large it encompassed the entire space. They glowed with pale blue light, pulsing in rhythm with words older than Rome, older than Egypt, older than written language itself. This is consecrated ground now, Draven continued, circling his frozen opponent with deliberate slowness, bound by magic that predates the council, that predates the covenant. I've spent 3 centuries studying the old ways, while you've spent 2 centuries chasing power. That's the difference between us, Silas. I don't just rule through fear, I rule through knowledge. Silas struggled against the invisible bonds, his supernatural strength meaningless against ancient magic. You can't kill me, he snarled. The council law's killing another vampire without trial. Who said anything about killing you? Draven stopped in front of him, pulling a small blade from inside his velvet coat. The knife was old, its silver surface covered in the same symbols that glowed on the floor. Death would be mercy, and you don't deserve mercy. He drew the blade across his own palm, ancient blood welling dark and rich. Then with the same blade he cut Silas's palm, a quick, precise motion that drew blood before Silas could even flinch. By the authority granted to me as Vampire King, Draven began, his voice taking on a resonance that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere, by the power of the old blood and the covenant of shadows. I invoke the curse of eternal wandering. He pressed his bleeding palm to Silas's, their blood mingling as the symbols on the floor blazed brighter. You are bound, Silas Bloodthorn, bound to walk but never settle, bound to wander but never rest. No territory shall welcome you, no coven shall harbor you. You are exiled from New Orleans, from Louisiana, from every land where vampire law holds sway. The magic wrapped around Silas like chains made of light and shadow. He screamed, not in physical pain, but in the sudden, crushing weight of understanding what was being taken from him. Your followers are released from their blood oaths to you, Draven continued relentlessly. Your territory is forfeit. Your name is stricken from the records of the Bloodthorn sect. You will walk alone through eternity, forever outside the community you sought to rule. The curse settled into Silas's bones, his blood, his very essence. Draven released him, and Silas fell to his knees, gasping despite not needing air. "This is impossible," Silas choked out. "This kind of magic, it hasn't been used in 500 years. Not since the last vampire who thought he could challenge the natural order." Draven finished. "His name was Alexander Morozov. Have you heard of him?" Silas's silence was answer enough. No one remembered Alexander, that was the point. "You have until dawn to leave the city," Draven said, his voice returning to its normal cold precision. "Every moment you remain after sunrise will cause you agony. The curse ensures it. You'll feel your bones burning, your blood turning to acid in your veins. Not enough to kill you. You're immortal after all, but enough to make you wish for death." Draven turned to leave, then paused. "Your people, Marcos, Lucinda, and the others who served you, they'll be given a choice. Swear loyalty to the council and accept its laws, or share your fate. Most will choose wisely. Loyalty to a fallen king is a luxury the desperate can't afford." "You can't do this," Silas said. But his voice was hollow, defeated. He could feel the curse working through him already, an invisible leash pulling him toward the city limits, toward exile, toward the endless wandering that would define his immortal existence. "I just did." Draven walked toward the exit where Marcus and Celeste waited. "I could have destroyed you, Silas. I could have ended your existence entirely. But I want you to live. I want you to walk the earth for centuries alone and powerless, a warning to every young vampire who thinks ambition is more important than wisdom." By the time Draven reached the doorway, Silas was already stumbling toward the opposite exit, his body driven by the curse toward the city limits and beyond. The Bloodthorn sect leader was finished, and Draven hadn't needed to throw a single punch. 6 months had changed everything and nothing. The Vampire King still ruled from his mansion in the Garden District. The Midnight Council still convened every first Thursday. The supernatural world still operated in shadows, hidden from mortal eyes by centuries of careful secrecy. But on Tuesday evenings, a 7-year-old girl with light brown curls climbed the steps to Draven Valdrich's front door and knocked 3 times, exactly as he taught her. "Come in, little one." Draven would call, and Audrey would push through the heavy oak door into a home that should have terrified her, but somehow felt safe. Tonight she arrived with her school backpack and a paper in her hand, marked with a gold star. "Look, I got an A on my history test, the one about ancient Rome, just like you taught me." Draven took the paper, examining it with the same careful attention he gave council documents. "Excellent work, though. I noticed they got the date of Caesar's assassination wrong. It wasn't the Ides of March by our modern calendar. The Julian calendar was different." "I know," Audrey grinned, flopping onto the leather couch in his study. "You told me like 100 times." Beverly appeared in the doorway, looking healthier than she had in years. The bruises had faded within days, helped by Draven's blood and his private physician, a witch who specialized in healing magic and asked no questions. She knew what Draven was now, had known since that night in the cathedral, and somehow, impossibly, she'd chosen to trust him anyway. "Don't let her monopolize your entire evening," Beverly said, though her smile was warm. "She has spelling homework too." "Latin first," Draven replied. "Spelling can wait." It had become their routine. Audrey would arrive with Beverly, spend 2 hours learning things no 7-year-old should be able to understand. Ancient languages, world history from someone who'd actually lived through it, philosophy from philosophers Draven had personally known. Then they'd have dinner in his formal dining room. Audrey chattering about school while Beverly and Draven discussed everything from local politics to the best places to find authentic beat, a family. Somehow, against all logic and 3 centuries of evidence to the contrary, Draven had found a family. Last week, Audrey had invited him to her school play. She was playing a tree in a production about the changing seasons. "You have to come," she'd insisted, her small hand gripping his with absolute certainty. "All the other kids' families will be there," Draven had attended, sitting in the back row where shadows gathered naturally, watching a 7-year-old girl hold her arms up like branches while children dressed as birds sang off-key about spring. It should have been beneath the Vampire King's dignity. It should have been a waste of his immortal time. Instead, it had been the most important 2 hours of his entire existence since 1723. Now, as the evening drew to a close, Audrey curled up against his side on the couch while he read to her from a book of myths, heroes and monsters, quests and transformations. The kind of stories that felt less like fiction to someone who'd lived as long as Draven had. "Did you ever meet a real hero?" Audrey asked sleepily, her eyes starting to drift closed. Draven looked down at her. This small, brave child who'd crashed through enchanted doors and begged a monster for help, who'd trusted him when she had no reason to, who'd reminded him that beneath 3 centuries of calculated coldness, Jean-Baptiste Valdric, the father, the husband, the man, still existed somewhere. "Yes," he said softly. "I met one 6 months ago." Audrey's breathing evened out, sleep claiming her mid-story. Her head rested against his shoulder, completely trusting, absolutely safe. Beverly appeared in the doorway, ready to carry her daughter home. But Draven raised a hand, asking for just one more moment. He looked at Audrey's peaceful face, and for just a heartbeat, he saw Eleanor, his daughter, lost to plague and time, who he'd failed to save. The guilt and grief that had driven him to immortality, to cruelty, to 300 years of emotional isolation. But this time, seeing Eleanor's face didn't shatter him. This time, it didn't feel like drowning in an ocean of loss. This time, it felt like forgiveness, like a second chance he'd never thought he'd deserve, like his daughter reaching across centuries to tell him it was okay to love again, okay to be human again, okay to let someone matter. Beverly crossed the room quietly, ready to take Audrey home, but she paused, seeing something in Draven's expression that made her reach out and gently touch his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Draven looked up at her. This mortal woman who'd somehow seen past the monster to the father beneath. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotions that had been frozen for 3 centuries. "Thank you, both of you, for reminding me that immortality doesn't have to mean being alone." He carefully lifted Audrey, carrying her to Beverly's car with supernatural ease, tucking a blanket around her that Marcus had thoughtfully provided. As Beverly drove away, Audrey's small hand pressed against the window in a sleepy wave. Draven stood in his doorway, watching them disappear into the New Orleans night. 300 years of darkness, 3 centuries of ruling through fear and isolation. And then a little girl with light brown curls had grabbed his coat and asked him to be brave. The Vampire King smiled, a real smile. Not the cold calculation he showed the council, but something genuine and human and alive. For the first time in 300 years, Draven Valdric was finally free.